This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Hello.
Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
You will know end.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
I'll make sure of something.
Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally.
Glory to the Scourge.
This is more like it.
First blood.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Now Frostmourne. For the Lich King. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Faithless coward.
This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Now Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last.
Glory to the Scourge.
Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Our allies' town needs help.
Speak, fool. At last. No one orders me around. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne
Our
hungers.
allies' town needs help.
Endless torment. For the Lich King. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At at last. This is more like it. At last.
Our
Frostborn
allies'
hungers.
town needs help.
At last. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
You will end this.
Finally.
Our allies' town needs help.
At last. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
Can I help you?
Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
I'll make sure you suffer.
This is more like it.
Your pain shall sit.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Our allies' town needs help.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally.
Glory to the scourge.
This is more
Our
like it.
allies' town needs help.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Now, Frostborn. Finally. This is more like it.
You will know end this.
Our allies' town needs help.
I'll make sure you suffer. You will know endless torment.
At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last.
Our allies' town needs
Frostborn
help.
hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally.
Our allies' town needs help.
At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Faithless coward.
Killing spree.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Dominate kill.
Are you threatening me?
Speak, fool. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
I'll make sure you suffer.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last.
Take your time. Look around.
Tread lightly. Now,
Fresh meat.
Frostmourne hungers.
Our allies' town
At
needs
last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
help. Our
Finally.
warriors have engaged the enemy.
This is more like it. No one orders me around.
Our allies' town needs help.
Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. For the Lich King.
Our warriors have
At
engaged the
last.
enemy.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally.
I'll make sure you suffer.
Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Our
At
allies'
last.
town needs help.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allies' town needs
last.
help.
Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers.
Fresh meat.
No one will
Mega kill.
This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Tread lightly. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Yes, my lord.
No one orders me around.
What?
What is it? Speak, fool.
This town needs help.
This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hunger. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Glory to the scourge. Glory to the scourge.
Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Fresh
This is
meat.
more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. Frostborn
Double
hungers.
kill.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
work! Tread lightly. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. For the Lich King. This is more like it. At last.
Fresh meat. Kill double kill. Dominant. Triple kill.
Finally. At last. Finally.
Hello.
At last.
Are you threatening me?
No one orders me around. Frostborn.
Mega kill. Ledge.
Frostborn hungers. This is at last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally.
Our
This is
allies'
more-
town needs help.
Fresh meat.
At last.
You will be endless to
Killing spree.
legendary.
This is more like it. At last.
Glory to the scourge.
Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it.
Where shall my blood be spilled?
Speak, fool.
Our allies' town needs help.
This is more like it. Now. Finally.
Glory to the Scourge!
Our allies' town needs help.
This is more like it.
Faithless coward!
Finally. Ah, at last.
Glory to the Scourge!
Finally.
Glory to the Scourge!
Double kill.
You will know endless.
Welcome to our village.
I am ready.
What
No,
ails you?
not like that.
Hello.
Let me do it.
Give me something to do!
Yes, me lord. You're interrupting
Yes,
my
my
calculations.
sir.
Welcome to our
Wait till you
village.
see me in action! Give me something to do!
Greetings,
There's
my
no
lord.
time to rest.
Are you threatening me?
No one was around. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary. I'll make sure you suffer.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Ah, at last. Finally. Ah, at last.
You will know endless toil. Faithless coward.
Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. No one was around. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
I'll make sure you suffer.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Now, Frostborn. Frostborn hungers.
Fresh meat.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Double kill.
This is more like it.
Double kill.
At last.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Glory to the Scourge.
This is more like it. Finally. For the Lich King. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Wait till you see me in action.
Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Fresh feet.
Glory to the Scourge.
Double kill.
At last.
Now,
Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Our allies' town needs help.
At last. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
I'll make sure you suffer.
Our allies' town needs help.
What news?
Hello.
Speak, fool.
Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
You will know everything.
Finally. At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last.
Are you threatening me?
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last.
Faithless coward. Glory to the Scourge.
At last.
Killing spree.